before we get started, just sorry.
It's okay, Felipe. You can text. Welcome, everyone. We're gonna give people a few minutes just to jump in, a couple of minutes. We know time is precious, but we want to make sure that we are not missing anyone. Thank you very much. We're delighted that you're here with us today. Bienvenidas, bienvenidas las personas que necesiten interpretación. Está el icono de la parte de abajo, el globo. Les animamos a que por favor lo utilicen para esta conversación. Welcome everyone. Those of you who need interpretation, we encourage you to please use the icon of the globe, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, and then choose the language that you need to listen to this conversation. We are just going to give a couple of minutes more. We are really delighted to have you all here. And we have a terrific group of panelists, people who are knowledgeable, familiar, and friendly to this topic, and who will help us all try to understand the confusion. Very, very challenging times we're facing. So we're really thrilled to have this conversation today. Welcome everyone. I'm going to repeat this in Spanish just to make sure. Quienes necesiten interpretación, tenemos interpretación del español al inglés, así que les pedimos que utilicen el icono del globo que está en la parte de abajo de su pantalla y que elijan la interpretación que necesiten para esta conversación. Nos da muchísimo gusto que estén aquí el día de hoy. Tenemos un grupo excepcional de panelistas, personas que saben mucho, pero que además les importa y están comprometidas con este tema, así que es realmente muy valioso que estemos acá. Nos da mucho, mucho gusto que estén acá, personas que están en las Américas y personas que no están en las Américas. Okay. I think we are going to start because time is precious. I'm wondering whether to speak in Spanish or in English. I am going to confess. So I'm going to go with English. But please, let's continue with the interpretation. Voy a empezar y voy a hacerlo en inglés. Les recuerdo la opción de la interpretación siempre disponible. So welcome everyone. This is a joint effort, as you could see from the invitation, of a number of organizations. And I'm going to start alphabetically from the bottom up to change logics for a while. So we have WOLA, the Washington Office for Latin America, here present, and Maureen Meyer from WOLA is one of our panelists. We have Refugees International, who has generously been our host today for this event. And we have Yael Shaher from Refugees International here today. We have IMUMI, el Instituto de las Mujeres para la Migración en México. Today we have the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, and we have Felipe Navarro here, as well as one of the panelists, and we have Crystal Sandoval from the Center for Democracy in the Americas. Is that correct, Crystal? Or am I changing your institutional affiliation? If not, please correct me right now.
Las Américas Immigrant Advocacy Center.
Okay, sorry about that. Las Americas Advocacy Center, you said?
Las
Okay.
Américas Immigrant Advocacy Center.
Las Americas Immigrants Advocacy Center. And the last organization is Alianza Americas. We have a lot of Americas here present today. And it's an irony because there's only one, one continent in spite of everything that is said about it. So I would like just to briefly tell everyone why we are gathered today. We have been working together in a number of spaces as organizations that are concerned for the topic of immigration and refugee rights in general and the situation in Latin America, as well as, of course, the impact of the US foreign policy on the region. And as the new administration has been in power, we have noticed that there is a huge influx of information and, of course, a lot of confusion. And I think that this is absolutely legitimate. We are all asking ourselves, what is going on? Is there still asylum? What policies remain in the region? We hear sometimes of news about temporary suspensions. Are they definite? Are they only temporary? We don't only have one source of information. In some cases, we receive information through executive orders. In other cases, there are press releases. Perdón, Maria Jose. Yes, when I introduced organizations, I did mention the Center for Democracy in the Americas, but I understand that Crystal is not from the Center for Democracy in the Americas. Yes, that's another of the co-organizing organizations of the event today. And so as we talk about this topic, we're really trying to understand what is going on, what is happening, and what's the actual situation on the ground. And we thought that it would be very, very important and valuable to have a conversation to try to understand better what is going on and what is going on at both sides of the border. That's why in this collective effort, these organizations that the co-convening organizations that I mentioned, Alianza Americas, SEDA, CGRS, IMUMI, Refugees International, WOLA, and Crystal, your organization is Advocacy. Can you repeat the name? Sorry.
Las Américas Immigrant Advocacy Center.
Las Américas Immigrant Advocacy Center, sorry. We decided to do this effort to have the conversation about what's happening in the two sides of the border. We want to have this conversation with interpretation into Spanish in the hopes that all of you can contribute to this wider debate and to a wider understanding of what is going on in the region. So that's something that I want to make sure that we all understand that it's part of the discussion. So let's begin with this one about what's happening from the perspective of the US. And in 1 week, at the same time, we will have a second conversation to discuss about what's happening outside of the US. And that is because the policies that are being implemented are not only having an impact within the US, but outside. So let's begin with the first conversation. What do we know about what is happening at the border, Maureen? How can you help us all understand? Is it a matter of rhetoric? Are we seeing changes? What we hear about the deployment of the military at the border. What is going on? Please help us understand.
Thank you, Elena, and thanks to all of the organizations that are co-hosting this with WOLA. I think there's two parts of this. I wanted to touch on one, who's arriving at the border right now? What does the border look like? I'm sure Crystal can add a lot, given that she's based in El Paso or in Texas, and where the heart of a lot of this is happening. But also then, what has been some of the big shifts in the response of the Trump administration? Before we go into what does this look like for asylum seekers and others seeking legal pathways to the United States, or the population, undocumented population already here. So I think if you look at the press, the past few days have basically highlighted the fact that while they're not final, February's numbers of migrants that were apprehended by Border Patrol at the border are at record lows. They were about 8,450 migrants who are apprehended crossing in between the ports of entry during that month. If we kind of put that in perspective, that's the lowest number on record for 25 years. We haven't had such a low number since 2000, which is actually the last period where we actually have public information about apprehensions. Now, if you look at January, where we do have official data, which is easier than to compare, and we combine both CBP numbers, so numbers of people apprehended by the Office of Field Operations at the ports of entry and Border Patrol agents, we're talking about 61,465 people that were taken into custody that month. That's 36% lower than December. So from last year, and certainly a lot lower than last year, although it's important to highlight that there had already been a slight drop in migration the last few months of the Biden administration, precisely because of the measures his government had adopted since mid last year to really close off access to asylum in the United States. Of who's coming, I think we're also continuing to see the similar nationalities, with Mexico topping the list, followed by Venezuela, Cuba, Guatemala, Honduras, and then Colombia, Ecuador, and then people from many other nationalities. It's important, though, to highlight that in January, for example, Border Patrol's apprehensions included 39% of the people were children or families with children. So certainly a lot of very vulnerable people also continuing to be encountered by U.S. Officials at the border. Now, in his campaign and throughout the first month of his office, Trump has really tried to seek to represent what's happening at the border as an invasion. In his inauguration speech, Trump said he would send troops to the southern border to repel the disastrous invasion of our country. And that rhetoric has really been used to both try to shape public opinion about why you need to have both mass deportations from the United States, but also a massive buildup at the border. And it's also been referenced in several of the executive orders that he issued starting on January 20th. One is actually titled Protecting the American People Against Invasion. And another, which is more, it's declaring a national emergency at the southern border of the United States, which is meant to justify the deployment of the Defense Department to have troops at the border, was also used in that context of invaders. Now, we would say these migrants are not invaders. Many of them have humanitarian needs and are requesting protection in the United States. More than 40% of the people apprehended in the past year have been children or families with children, but this is certainly the way it's been, portrayed. Now, it's also not clear whether you could even say using an argument of like security threats, invasion, would actually pass some of the legal challenges that may occur if Trump continues to go down this route, which would be maybe invoking the Aliens Enemy Act, which would be difficult because we're not really being attacked by a foreign government. But these are, again, it's just like, I think a lot of the rhetoric around what's happening is important, particularly as it shapes what the actions are of the government. Now, the interesting thing about the past few days is Trump came out over the weekend and said, because the numbers are so low, that the invasion of our country is over. This was a post he made on Truth Social on Saturday, so calls into question, if you keep trying to justify what's happening as an invasion, well, then how does that pair with what the president himself is saying about what's happening at the border? Regardless, what is happening at the border is a very massive military buildup. On Saturday, the Pentagon announced that it was sending another 3,000 additional troops to the southwestern border. This includes some of the Army's most experienced combat units. In total, there are about 9,000 active duty troops on the border, in addition to 4,500 Texas National Guardsmen that have been commandeered by Governor Abbott that have been used at the border in recent years. And the Border Patrol actually deputized 590 of Texas's state National Guard personnel to basically enable them to also enforce immigration law, acting as if they're Border Patrol agents. If you take these numbers, we have about 13,500 members of the military, another 16,500 Border Patrol agents. We're talking about over 30,000 security agents at the border, which is almost equal to the amount of migrants that the Border Patrol actually apprehended in the month of January. So you've got one migrant per agent being apprehended in a whole month. So clearly very low numbers, but also huge security presence at the border. I think the other part of the use of the military, one has been the use of military deportation flights. Just sent by one of our partner organizations said that today that the Pentagon has announced they're not doing deportation flights using military planes in the future. We'll see if that's going to be the case. But in February, there were 19 military deportation flights and 13 lateral flights to Guantanamo. Plus, the Coast Guard has lateral flights between Texas to California. These are all, if you want further data, documented by Tom Cartwright from Witness at the Border. So there have been these flights. We'll see if they're used in the future, but certainly using military infrastructure has been part of what we're seeing at the border. The Buckley Space Force Base in Colorado and Fort Bliss in El Paso have both been used to be a staging and transportation area for the growing number of people that are being subject to mass deportation, and that is expected to be just the start. So using perhaps at least 10 or more military bases as a place to hold migrants before they're returned to their home country. I'm going to wrap up with why is this a problem? I think obviously there is a huge cost to using the military in these activities. The deportation flights by the military are not efficient. They cost 1.5 times or more as much. But it's also how this takes away, military units, elite units from perhaps more national security activities. But beyond that, WOLA as an organization has spent decades criticizing the use of militaries in law enforcement activities, militaries as police, because they're not trained to be interacting in the same way with vulnerable populations. Militaries are mostly trained for combat situations. And when you have soldiers performing internal security missions involving interacting with civilians, particularly in this case, vulnerable and trauma-affected migrants and children, there is a large concern and a probability of having more abuses and human rights violations occur. WOLA and partner organizations in the past year have also documented, for example, how frequently Texas National Guards have been improperly involved in lethal and non-lethal force incidents against migrants, denying them the right to enter the country, seek asylum, denying first aid and water. So I think there's a lot of concern about how having so many security agents at the border could just lead to further abuse against a very vulnerable population. So I'm going to wrap it up with that, and certainly look forward to hearing from my colleagues and to further our conversation.
Thank you, Maureen, for setting the stage of some of these elements. As you can see on the question box, there are a number of questions about the sources of information. So please begin to look at those so that then we can have a round of questions, of answers to those questions. Felipe, there is then this declaration of an invasion at the border. The need to bring the military forces to protect supposedly the US against this threat. What is actually happening with the human right to seek asylum? What is happening with those individuals that are arriving to the US seeking protection?
Thank you so much, Elena. I will share my screen and I will switch to Spanish. So let me just share my screen.
We can see it. Thank you.
Gracias. Bueno, buenas tardes o días a los que están en el oeste de California, en California, por ejemplo, a todos y todos. Empiezo por diciendo que las acciones ejecutivas de la administración Trump dejan algo en claro, como Maureen mencionó, que es una estrategia amplia para presentar la migración y el desplazamiento como una invasión, militarizar la frontera y desmantelar las vías de protección. En esta discusión me voy a centrar en dos acciones ejecutivas que afectan directamente a la capacidad de las personas solicitantes de asilo para acceder a la protección, así como otras dos que, si bien no están dirigidas explícitamente a personas que buscan asilo o inmigrantes en general, pueden tener implicaciones para esta población. Y sí quiero notar que si bien el impacto de estas acciones ejecutivas es amplio, va más allá de lo que voy a hablar, me estaré enfocando en los efectos sobre las personas que buscan asilo, particularmente, como mencionaste tú, Elena, el derecho a pedir asilo. Bueno, en primer lugar, tenemos la proclamación presidencial que Maureen mencionó, garantizando la protección de los estados contra la invasión, que declara, como se mencionó, que se está produciendo una invasión en la frontera sur de Estados Unidos. El gobierno está aplicando esta proclamación para impedir que las personas no ciudadanas se presenten en los puertos de entrada y para expulsarlas de manera sumaria si entran sin inspección. La proclamación sostiene erróneamente que el presidente tiene la autoridad para suspender la entrada de personas no ciudadanas en la frontera sur y anular o suspender las leyes migratorias aprobadas por el Congreso con el propósito de proteger a los estados en Estados Unidos de esta supuesta invasión, aunque hay que recalcar que el alcance y la identidad de las personas que supuestamente están invadiendo a Estados Unidos sigue siendo profundamente ambiguo. No sabemos exactamente quién es la identidad de estos invasores. La orden invoca la sección 212F de la Ley de Inmigración y Nacionalidad para imponer una prohibición generalizada, negando efectivamente el acceso al asilo de manera categórica a quienes quedan sujetos a la suspensión. La administración justifica esta exclusión masiva bajo argumentos de seguridad y salud pública, alegando que las personas que llegan a la frontera carecen de controles adecuados. Este tipo de expulsiones se asemeja a las expulsiones bajo el título 42 que vimos implementadas por primera vez por la administración Trump en 2020. Aunque la base legal es distinta en esta ocasión, el efecto sigue siendo el mismo, que es eludir las protecciones existentes para expulsar rápidamente a los solicitantes de asilo sin ningún debido proceso. En la práctica, estamos viendo rechazos en la frontera y expulsiones sumarias a terceros países, entre ellos Panamá. No voy a profundizar en los acuerdos que facilitan estas expulsiones o deportaciones, pero la parte 2 de ese seminario web que Elena mencionó y que se llevará a cabo el próximo miércoles abordará estos acuerdos y las condiciones en esos países. Sobre esta proclamación presidencial, a principios de febrero, CGRS, junto con ACLU y NIJC, presentó una demanda contra la implementación de la proclamación en representación de las organizaciones Raíces, Las Américas, que nos acompaña hoy, y el Florence Immigrant Rights Project, así como 13 individuos. Es importante recalcar que la proclamación no contempla excepciones para familias, para sobrevivientes de trata de personas, ni para niños y niñas, y ya ha causado daños graves a las personas afectadas, así como las organizaciones que los asisten. El argumento central de la demanda es que las disposiciones invocadas en la proclamación no pueden anular el derecho a las personas a solicitar asilo ni otras formas de protección establecidas en la ley. Como mínimo, los agentes migratorios deberían estar remitiendo a quienes expresan temor a regresar a su país a una entrevista para evaluar si califican para la protección, algo que no están haciendo en este momento. Las partes en el litigio están presentando argumentos ante la Corte en estas semanas y se espera que la Corte emita un fallo sumario en algún momento a partir o después de abril. Pasando al siguiente punto, tenemos la orden ejecutiva asegurando nuestras fronteras, que de cierta manera restablece políticas de disuasión severas que vimos durante el primer periodo de Trump y en la práctica restringe aún más el acceso al asilo. Por ejemplo, vemos que reinstaura los mal llamados protocolos de protección a migrantes, MPP por sus siglas en inglés, una política que, como pueden saber, fue implementada por la administración Trump en 2019, que obliga a los solicitantes de asilo a permanecer en México mientras sus casos son procesados en tribunales de migración en Estados Unidos. En esta nueva implementación de MPP, ya se han visto algunos casos reportados asignados a las cortes en El Paso, Texas y San Diego, California. Más allá de MPP, esta orden ejecutiva también elimina el uso de la aplicación CBP1 como mecanismo para acceder al asilo u otras protecciones humanitarias a la frontera, lo que llevó en su momento, en el momento del anuncio de la orden ejecutiva, a la cancelación de aproximadamente 30,000 citas que ya estaban programadas. Esta orden ejecutiva, además, instruye al Departamento de Estado a negociar acuerdos para retornar personas a terceros países seguros, lo que sugiere una posible reactivación de los acuerdos de cooperación de asilo, que fueron nuevamente implementados durante la primera administración Trump. Estos acuerdos fueron originalmente firmados con Honduras, El Salvador y Guatemala y fueron diseñados para transferir a las personas solicitantes de asilo a esos países con el argumento de que podían solicitar protección allí. Aunque la administración Biden anuló estos acuerdos, la normativa que los autoriza sigue vigente. Ahora, si estos acuerdos se reintroducen, probablemente van a diferir de los acuerdos actuales que vemos con Panamá y en otros países que hemos visto en las noticias y que discutiremos la próxima semana. Lo menciono simplemente porque, a diferencia de los acuerdos de cooperación de asilo, estos nuevos acuerdos funcionan principalmente como mecanismos de expulsión o de deportación, sin ninguna referencia a la posibilidad de solicitar protección. Entonces, quiero señalar esa diferencia. Sobre MPP, CGRS, mi organización, junto con Innovation Law Lab y NIP NLG, ha estado litigando una acción colectiva contra la implementación de MPP desde 2020. La demanda representa a todas las personas sometidas a MPP que, por diversas razones, no fueron procesadas durante el primer intento por parte de la administración Biden de terminar el programa antes de que una corte en Texas suspendiera abruptamente el proceso en 2021. Dado que la administración Biden reconoció públicamente que MPP es indefendible como política, en gran parte debido a las barreras que impone el derecho a solicitar asilo, el equipo legal considera que los demandantes tienen una posición sólida. Ahora, dado que esta demanda impugna directamente la legalidad de la implementación de MPP, tras el anuncio de su restablecimiento, los demandantes solicitaron a la Corte que suspenda la implementación hasta que se emita un fallo definitivo en el caso, el cual sigue pendiente en este momento. Y, pues, por supuesto, la decisión sobre esta solicitud específica también sigue pendiente. Finalmente, quiero señalar dos órdenes ejecutivas que podrían impactar a las personas que buscan asilo. La primera orden ejecutiva, la designación de carteles como organizaciones terroristas extranjeras, que me parece que Maureen mencionó, amenaza con imponer nuevas barreras a ciertos solicitantes de asilo o barreras al acceso al asilo, especialmente para quienes son reclutados por fuerza en estos grupos o quienes han actuado bajo coacción de estos grupos. Esto es algo que desde CGRS estamos monitoreando de cerca y tenemos previsto emitir guías para los abogados que litigan estos casos a medida que la situación evoluciona. Por otro lado, también tenemos una orden ejecutiva llamada Defendiendo a las mujeres del extremismo de la ideología de género y restableciendo la verdad biológica, la cual es una orden ejecutiva explícitamente antigénero, antitrans y antipersonas de género no conforme. Eh, Esta orden ordena que las agencias federales solo reconozcan dos sexos inmutables, masculino y femenino. Esto puede afectar, aunque si bien va más allá de la población migrante, esto puede afectar a inmigrantes y solicitantes de asilo de diferentes maneras, incluyendo el impacto en el formulario de inmigración, documentos emitidos por el gobierno y, por supuesto, políticas de detención. Esta orden ejecutiva también genera preocupación para solicitantes de asilo trans y de género no conforme, y aún no está claro si el gobierno modificará las directrices existentes para estos casos. A la fecha, es importante tener en cuenta que la jurisprudencia vigente respalda estas solicitudes de asilo, pero es importante tener en cuenta que anticipamos que el gobierno imponga nuevas restricciones al asilo basado en género de manera general, en línea con las políticas implementadas durante su primera administración. Pero, aclaro, esto es algo que esperamos, pero que no ha ocurrido todavía. Y con eso lo dejo ahí y encantado de seguir la discusión con los compañeros.
Muchísimas gracias, Felipe. Thank you, Felipe. We are putting the blocks, trying to depict a full picture. We will have the recording of this webinar. There are a number of questions on the chat about that, and Felipe's PowerPoint presentation. If other speakers have PowerPoint presentations or other resources from your organizations that you want to point the audience to, we will also send that. Yael, you have the challenge of continuing depicting this picture of what has changed and how we are experiencing both limits to the right of asylum and the crumbling of other forms of protection. Can you please share with us?
Sure, and I'm so grateful that I get to go after Maureen and Felipe because they set the groundwork and make it easier for me to put the next block in. So thanks for having me. So as Maureen and Felipe have mentioned, this second Trump administration has ramped up its restrictions on asylum and the use of the military for enforcement beyond anything it had tried during its first term. I think the administration's strategy overall is to try the most extreme anti-immigrant policies as possible, see what survives court challenge, and revert to sort of slightly less extreme policies as necessary if the court tells them that they can't, right? So I think that came out of the gate swinging. As Maureen had pointed out with the invasion rhetoric and the use of the military to really drum up this picture for everybody of what's happening, not really true or not reflective of what's happening, but that was the idea. And then all that slew of executive orders that Felipe discussed, sort of adding it up and adding it up. As President Trump said last night in his speech, the administration is also waiting on Congress to provide it with the funding it needs to carry out its mass deportation plans. So, as I will explain, besides cutting off legal pathways to the United States, like asylum, parole, and refugee resettlement, what it's now trying to do is lay the groundwork to revoke the legality of the presence of many immigrants in the United States, many of whom have parole, temporary protected status, or are applicants for asylum or visas in the United States, so that should the administration get the money from Congress, it can then target a larger number of people for deportation. So sort of setting those pieces in place. The Trump administration claims it will target criminals, those with final orders of removal, but also anybody in the United States illegally, and then defines that term illegally extremely broadly. What we saw with the deportations of Venezuelans to Guantanamo, which I want to talk about now, where the detention conditions were horrible, extremely horrible. This was sort of a theatrical version of this. Some of those sent to Guantanamo had alleged gang ties. Some were detained in ICE facilities in the United States with final orders of removal. Some had entered legally with CBP-1 appointments at the border. And these were all these people were lumped together and flown to Guantanamo to be held there. Then, in the face of a challenge to the legality of the detention of those folks at Guantanamo, the administration flew that group of Venezuelans to Honduras, where they were picked up by a Venezuelan plane and returned to Venezuela. Since then, the administration has sent additional people, including Central Americans, who the U.S., if they wanted to, could deport directly to those countries in Central America. So this idea that they're sending people to Guantanamo because they can't deport them to their home countries, that's not the case, certainly for the people who have been sent recently. And the court challenges to the people who have been sent now continues. It's ongoing. The crux of the lawsuit is against sending people to Guantanamo is that there is actually no authority under the immigration law to transfer and detain people who have reached the United States to Guantanamo. The court might agree with this argument because there really isn't that authority under the immigration law. So what the administration has recently announced, and I think Maureen touched on this, was its plan to use military bases in the United States for detention instead. And Fort Bliss near El Paso, where Crystal is the place where they're going to start that effort. And they're sort of one of the executive orders basically told the military to get plans ready for this and to figure out how to use bases for detention. And something that was just announced was that what the military planes that the administration had been using until this month to send people out of the country for deportations have stopped. They were extremely expensive and actually held fewer people than regular commercial planes. Perhaps this is indicating that the administration is planning to shift to increase deportations precisely to those countries that didn't accept military planes. So I'm a little bit worried about Colombia. I'm a little bit worried about Mexico, where using military planes was a no-no for deportations. In its executive orders and in subsequent policy memos and Federal Register notices, the Trump administration has ended the use of CBP-1 to schedule appointments to enter at the border. It has stopped processing applications for people coming through group parole programs like the ones for Cubans, Haitian, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And it has announced earlier terminations for TPS for about 600,000 Venezuelans, which is now, rather than ending later, is supposed to end on April 2nd, 2025, and for about 500,000 Haitians. The date for terminating that TPS has moved up to August 3rd. It had been in 2026. The administration has also called on USCIS, which is the agency that processes immigrant benefit applications, to stop doing this, to stop processing benefit applications, such as applications for asylum or adjustment of status, filed by parolees who came in on the CHMV program or through other family unification parole programs, like the ones for Haitians or Cubans or Ecuadorians or Salvadorans or Guatemalans or Hondurans or Colombians that was introduced at the end of the Biden administration. It has also called for enforcement by arresting, issuing removal orders, and using expedited removal for the parolee population in the United States. There has been a lawsuit filed challenging the arbitrary ending of the parole program and the refusal to process those applications by parolees. There have also been several lawsuits filed about the administration's decisions on TPS. So far, we have seen some, but not many arrests and detentions of people who have pending asylum and TPS applications. Any is extremely concerning, but we haven't seen it on a large scale yet. And actually, but today there was a hearing on that called by the House Republicans on sanctuary cities and the way local law enforcement in the United States should participate on enforcement. And a case came up in that hearing of a person who was an applicant for asylum from Honduras who has been arrested and detained. The hearing on sanctuary cities is part of the Trump administration's efforts to force local officials to support immigration enforcement in the United States. And I should say, House Republicans have released reports condemning parole and TPS programs, or condemning them as programs that encourage trafficking and illegal immigration. So it's part of this effort to portray people who are legally here as somehow illegal immigrants and justify enforcement against them. So there's this rhetorical effort also to portray things like parole and like TPS as illegal in and of themselves. As a way to sort of, again, as Helena said, an overall effort to justify enforcement against immigrants who are legally here and to attack humanitarian and protected statuses that exist. They're also sort of in line with the justification of the administration regarding the TPS decisions on Venezuela and Haiti. These are decisions that were not based on an assessment of the country conditions in Venezuela or Haiti. They basically just falsely portray people with TPS in the United States as burdens on the country. And that's basically the justification for the decisions. I just want to kind of portray the sort of way that this is being conveyed by the administration. Generally, I just want to say people with parole and TPS are legally working in the United States and cannot be deported now, right? So a lot of these policy memos and decisions are geared towards the administration's efforts to scare people into self-deportation before they lose their status and their work permit. So I just want to make clear sort of what this is all about, and that emphasize that there are legal challenges to all of these things. So, we shouldn't concede in advance on these things. I want to discuss one more group of policy changes, and that's related to refugee resettlement. The reason this is important, especially for this webinar, is because the Biden administration dramatically expanded access to resettlement in Latin America in a way that had not been done before through the safe mobility offices that were set up in Colombia, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Ecuador. Through executive orders and subsequent policy decisions, the Trump administration has basically banned refugee resettlement. full stop. Stop refugees slated to fly to the United States from doing so. So these are people who were ready to go on January 20th, and they have stopped those flights, not just from Latin America, but from all over the world. Close the SMOs in Latin America, cancel contracts with the resettlement agencies, which are the NGOs that process people and help people come to the United States, and cut off funding for services to refugees already in the United States, many of them getting them through the refugee agencies and their affiliates. Again, there are lawsuits challenging these policies, both the refugee ban and the defunding of refugee resettlement, which is basically what's happening. But despite some court orders, refugees are not arriving in the United States, and the resettlement agencies and their affiliates are currently cut off from funding. So this is a huge deal because it means that the big resettlement agencies are furloughing and laying off staff and closing offices both in the United States and in the region where they were present. And this is also wound up in the whole discussion and the policies and the legal cases around the cutoff of aid and State Department grants in general, because many of these resettlement agencies were getting grants from the State Department, from the US State Department. So they're all involved, and the decision from the Supreme Court this morning on this issue, basically saying that money has to flow, that's great. It was a very modest decision, but what we have seen with legal decisions in this space so far is even the court decisions have not really gotten the money flowing again. And so that I think there's a lot left for that. And I think we're going to deal with that much more in the next webinar in this series. But I just wanted to place that, the way that refugee resettlement was impacted by some of those policies as well. I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Yael. There are a number of questions about the parolees, so please look at them. And I think we're going to ask you to go back to that, because that and the situation of those who are seeking asylum, who perhaps have a work authorization while their application is pending, that has generated a number of questions as well. So we continue to paint this picture that very sadly and tragically is really a very bleak one. And so now let's move to Crystal. There is, of course, another side to this, which is the impact of these policies on the work that organizations are doing. And so, Crystal, what can you share with us about that specific impact of the funding cuts?
Thank you, Elena. Specifically echoing what Yael said, everybody already kind of like laid the land for everyone about how we're seeing everything as it plays out, I guess. It's, as community-based organizations, we're already dealing with a lot of marginalized communities, with people that are severely impacted by this, what everybody mentioned previously. And we are often in the front lines of providing like the legal support to individuals facing deportation, to asylum seekers, to refugees, and others who are in very, very precarious situations. And when we talk about funding, it exacerbates the struggle even more under like the funding cuts of this level. We're not only seeing it like on the US side, but we're also seeing it on the Mexican side, and specifically about El Paso, right? And I think that the feeling is it's gradual. It's like throughout the whole border, but I will speak directly from my perspective from Las Americas. The funding it's impacting at some point, we saw it cutting services for legal service providers in the court and detention centers. We saw how that impacted people. That just created more fear of people that are already in our area in El Paso and also in Juarez with the cut of CBP1. People didn't know what to do, and there's very limited availability of legal service provider as it is, and then just cutting the funding, it just takes out that part as well. And then we also see the some of the international organizations leaving, and their support, and sometimes to elevate certain things. We see not only in El Paso, but in the state of Texas, we see some organizations leaving, not being here, and then also in the Mexican side also. And that just puts some more work on the local grassroots organizations that are here, that sometimes that cannot be fulfilled. And there's also the talk about burnout regarding this type of work, right? As more as this policies grow hostile, and then the funding is cut down, then there's less of us, and then more of us that have to step in to provide the services, which can ultimately impact the quality of work. People may also feel that they might not be able to find the legal providers and might make decisions or not be able to navigate this very complex immigration system. And obviously, with everything ever changing, when executive orders are announced and things are announced, people often are led into gossip and other things. So that also creates issues that sometimes weren't able to respond to immediately, just because of all the work that this creates, of course. And then obviously there's the threats to long-term sustainability, right? Like, we don't know how long this is going to be sustainable for. How long are we going to be able to provide all this legal services under all this decrease in funding? And even if, for example, there was the determination that one of the legal providers would close down, that will not make the case itself by themselves, or the necessity of these services to not exist. That will just, increment the amount of work that needs to be done by the organizations that are left. So that's what I have. I can also add that on the ground, just talking about like what some of you are seeing, I did want to mention that we are seeing people with active TPS in detention. That creates a lot of fear, talking about what Yael was mentioning. And, it's hard to navigate those type of things. Sometimes with what Maureen was mentioning about the human rights and those things, it's hard with not somebody, from example, like from one of the big organizations in Texas, right? Like UNHCR is not in Texas anymore. The nearest person for us to be able to extend this would be in California. So those are little things that are very impactful when you talk about cutting the funding, and like how we're seeing it on the ground. Like, these are very specific cases that we're dealing with. Obviously, the cases that we had that were transferred to Guantanamo, and when we got CBP-1, we got all these people waiting and thinking about how they were going to be able to seek asylum in the United States, where there's no asylum right now, or no way to seek it anyway. And there's not enough people to be there on the ground to make sure that these people that need to access it, or that need to be in the bridge to present before a CBP officer, is able to, I guess, give them information, or accept them, or process them, or whatever it is that needs to happen under law. So those are very unfortunate situations.
Thank you, Crystal. So there are a number of questions in the chat that I would like to make very clear that we will address in the second webinar. So the first thing is, please register. I am going to put the link on the chat for our next conversation that Maria Jose is going to moderate, because we're going to go in deep into what is happening south of the border. What changes are we observing in migration patterns? If people now understand that they cannot reach the US, what is happening in the region? There is another question also that I would also like to say that will be part of the next conversation, which is around the responses of the countries of the region. How is Mexico? How is Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama, Honduras, El Salvador? How are they responding? Those will also be part of the next conversation. Tune in 1 week for that part. So there are many and I am going to try to ask a few questions and allow some of you to go through them. There is, as I mentioned, Maureen, a question about how can people track what infrastructure is being used? What is the actual cost of the implementation of these actions? You mentioned also how the source that tracks flights. So if you would like to share some of that information. I think there is, people want to understand better what rights do the persons who are detained in Guantanamo have? Can they seek asylum? Do they have access to an attorney? There is a wider one for all of you, which is how can we build a counter narrative against those policies that are being implemented? That is a difficult question. And the fourth one that I would like to add to this round is, what dangers or risks do people have who were granted asylum or were working in the US? What is the situation of refugees? People who had sought asylum elsewhere and were resettled in the US, as we are painting this situation. So, Maureen, do you want to begin this round of answers?
Sure, I'll try to be quick, and thanks. It was great to hear everybody else's insight and work on all of these important issues. I would say on what's going on with infrastructure, et cetera. I'm not sure who tracks things day to day. My colleague Adam Isaacson has a weekly border update that you can subscribe to. I'll post it in the chat. That kind of goes through like the news of the week in terms of both what's happening in the US and at the border, in particular on migration, and then a little bit south of the border. That I think in terms of if we want to know where the most recent deployments are or what's happening, that's a good source for that. We also have like updated graphics that we generally tend to look at for that. I think there'll be a lot to talk about once we know what happens with the budget. And I think that is something that, Felipe and others flagged of what the administration wants to do with the mass deportation infrastructure depends on what happens with the reconciliation bill, which is being discussed hand in hand with the 2025 budget, which is also a big unknown in terms of what will happen with the funding for that. I did want to just flag, I think, two things. I'm not sure with counter the narrative, it's a challenge. I think on that one important thing, though, is how we engage with Congress on these issues, because there's a lot to talk about. How do we talk about the contributions of migrants to the United States, et cetera? But the other is how Congress can still exercise a role and how members can still speak out. I think it's been interesting to see, for example, even with the TPS cancellation or the announcement for Venezuelans, that we have bipartisan legislation again reintroduced, the Venezuelan Adjustment Act, that would adjust legal status for certain Venezuelans. There's a lot that can be done from the oversight point of view that Congress should be doing more in terms of what's happening with detention center conditions, what's happening with asylum processing. That's, even within those that are already in the procedures in the United States. What do the flights, what are the legal guarantees of the flights? Or what does the situation look like in Guantanamo? What are deportation practices that may or may not be violating current US standards? So I think there is a need to really, in terms of the narrative, also use our voice in the United States to reach out to our congressional offices and advocate for them to use their voice, even if it is more in the oversight role now and not the ability to change legislation, sometimes to keep pushing on these issues. And I think on our role too, of how do we keep looking at how can our work and our research contribute to some of the lawsuits that are happening. I know there's a question there of what might happen with them. I think our role has been to how can our research actually help support some of the litigation that's happening in the United States. So I will leave it at that. I think there's a lot of other great questions there, and I'm sure my colleagues can answer them better than I can.
Thank you, Maureen. Please don't forget to put the link so that people can register to that very valuable source of information. Yeah, there are many questions. I think you really made everyone feel concerned. There are questions about refugees, about asylees, about people with humanitarian parole. So can you please go over each of them?
Right. So the question about Guantanamo, for that you asked before, I just want to put that on one side. I mean, I think the goal of the goal of the administration in using Guantanamo ultimately is to try to get people away from access to their counsel, to lawyers, because it's basically very, very, very difficult I mean, it's very difficult to access counsel in general when you're in detention, but like when you're in Guantanamo, it's they set up a phone line, but it's almost impossible. And most of the people sent to Guantanamo, if not everybody, were already in removal proceedings or detained, or they had final orders of removal. So I don't think that would apply to people with current TPS status, certainly, who are, if a person has TPS status, like the law literally says a person with TPS status cannot be detained and certainly cannot be removed anywhere. Currently, TPS holders with TPS status do not have to worry about that. If they lose their TPS status, which is what we know, what the Trump administration would like to do, terminate TPS status, then the question becomes, will the administration try to put those people in removal proceedings and try to arrest them, right? So that's what we're talking about a few months from now. It's not tomorrow, but it's something that we want the legislation to push back on and prevent, so that we don't get to the point where the Trump administration is trying to put TPS holders or former TPS holders in removal proceedings and to deport them. With parole, there was a good question of parole. Okay, so parole is an extremely insecure status. So if you have it, it's fine, but once it's terminated, you're really left without status, which is why it's so important for the administration to and one of the things that's being challenged is also the administration refusing to process asylum applications of those people who have parole, right? And I think the question about whether asylum seekers, somebody who has an outstanding application for asylum, so if the person is an asylum seeker, has an outstanding application for asylum, they could be in two postures. They could be in removal proceedings. And so they've applied for asylum through immigration court, in which case those have to continue. You have to, there's a process in immigration court that continues. And we've seen a few efforts by the Trump administration very few efforts for the Trump administration to have ICE go to immigration court and say, I would like to terminate these removal proceedings and put people in a faster form of removal and expedited removal proceedings. Very rare. That's a lot of effort to do that in every case. So I think people who are in removal proceedings could, for the most part, trust that those removal proceedings will continue and they'll be able to push through their asylum applications in immigration court. For people who have applied for asylum affirmatively, through USCIS, who may have come in through the parole program and then applied for asylum, slightly different. But if you have an asylum application that's outstanding, the regulations now in place say that you have to have that affirmative asylum interview before anything else can happen to you, right? You can't be removed until you have that interview. So again, I don't want to make people super, super nervous. I think the key point is that people should continue applying for any status for which they're eligible. It's very important. Talk to attorneys, seek out legal support. There are lots of know your rights and KYR resources available for people who are trying to apply for asylum on their own. It's always best to talk to an attorney if you can. And I can put some of those KYR resources or share after the webinar, a couple of resources about that for people worrying about that. But I think the most important thing is that there are lawsuits outstanding to sort of challenge the lack of following procedure as to how you're supposed to deal with applicants for asylum who are in that. And so I think that we can have some confidence that people who have outstanding applications won't just be like summarily deported. I don't want to portray that. That's the fear that the Trump administration is trying to, convey, that they want people to self-deport. There is some concern that, applications for work authorization will be processed. And if that's the case, people won't be able to work legally. And that is a real problem and a real concern because, so there are real concerns out there. But I want to temper it by saying that the best thing you can do is to apply for everything that you're eligible for. And again, I'll share resources about that. Is there any questions that I missed? I think I got most of everything. Yeah.
I think you got the most for this round because they keep on coming, and this is really very encouraging. It really shows that there is a legitimate need for information, and we are very happy of providing this service. And I should also indicate that you can look on the websites of the organizations that are speaking today and all of the organizations that are co-convening this effort. We are trying to produce resources in many cases as friendly as possible, also so that as there are outcomes in the courts, we can disseminate those outcomes more widely, because we understand that it's very difficult to keep up. This is a moving and transforming situation day by day. It's hard for us, and all we do is try to understand and keep updated on what's going on. So we fully understand. Felipe, you are designated as the person to respond that difficult question about counter narratives against these policies. Do you want to try?
Sure. I am not a communications expert, so probably I won't have anything too insightful to say, but I think it was sort of touched on. I think either Yellow Marine touched on it. I think that the right, sort of like Republicans in Congress and political campaigns have been very effective and as painting, as we said, what's happening at the border as an invasion and dehumanizing those who approach our border seeking protection, or more broadly seeking a better life. And I think that a core strategy to counter that, not saying that it would be easy in any way, is to sort of remind people of the human aspect of what's happening, remind people of the human impact. And a way of doing that is, like it was mentioned, documented what is happening not only at our border, whether it's enforcement in the interior, whether people being sent to other countries, and using those stories to make visible the conditions of this population and why these policies are inhumane. And then added to that, we can also show, and many organizations here and across the United States, including through the Welcome with Dignity campaign, are also showing the administration that there is a way of doing this in a way that is both orderly and dignified. There is no reason morally or legally to paint everyone arriving at the border as an invader and to treat them like criminals.
Thank you. Thank you, Felipe. Crystal, there is a specific question that was addressed to you, and that's the one about the persons with TPS that you said that are being detained in El Paso sector. Could you share a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, of course. We currently have cases of a few people that went to their check-ins with ICE and were detained that have active TPS status. They're specifically from Venezuela, the ones that we have found. I don't know if there's more. Like I mentioned, there's a few of us and a lot of demand, unfortunately. But yeah, there's some cases that we're seeing where people are being detained with active TPS. And like Yael mentioned, this is specifically under US code. A person cannot be detained if they have an active TPS case.
Thank you, Crystal. So there are also a couple of questions, and I think, yeah, these may be connected to your presentation about how do we interpret what's going on with TPS? The TPS extension for El Salvador stands, and so there is a question as to how do we understand that TPS extension continues, while as there was a decision on the contrary for the case of Venezuela as well as Haiti. And of course, that is something that people are wondering a lot. So that, Yael, is for you.
Okay, and I'd be glad for others to jump in, if they kind of disagree with my take or want to add anything on this. I mean, so I think what's very clear about the TPS policies under the Trump administration is that they're clearly politically motivated and have very little to do with what is supposed to drive TPS designations, which is the conditions in the country that's being designated for TPS. So it's very clear from the campaign of President Trump that he had a target on Venezuelans and Haitians for deportation, regardless of how they came to the United States, especially if they came in through parole, which the Trump administration has never really thought was legal, right? They never really believed that those were legal pathways, and that regardless of whether or not the people had legal right to be in the country, whether the Trump administration referred to the Haitians in Springfield and to the Venezuelans living in Aurora as illegal immigrants, even though they had the legal right to be here. So they already had said that they were illegally here. And then, as I mentioned in my presentation, the decisions and the memos from the DHS secretary that changed, that terminated basically TPS for those countries early, revoking what Secretary Mayorkas had put in place last year, were not about conditions in Venezuela or Haiti. I mean, conditions in Haiti have gotten worse, 100% gotten worse since Secretary Mayorkas' designations. There's not a question. Nobody disagrees. In fact, they didn't even try to make the argument really that conditions. They said maybe the security mission from Kenya it has not helped. So that it's really the conditions in the countries, and they started using another rationale, which is the sort of national interest rationale, that basically TPS for these countries are not in the U.S. national interest, defined so broadly and based on the invasion and burden narratives around immigration that we've been discussing the whole webinar. So that was sort of that. And I think with El Salvador, to be honest, when Secretary Rubio went to on his trip to the region in late January, early February, it was very clear that he was very excited with President Bukele, and that President Bukele offered to basically allow his jails to be used for anybody the U.S. wanted to send there, citizen, non-citizen, whatever. And that kind of thing, I think, and that kind of relationship is what is actually driving a lot of these policies, right? So our certainly in the case with El Salvador, I think that issue about U.S. relations with El Salvador and what the U.S. might want to get from El Salvador for its sort of keeping TPS for El Salvador alive, sort of keep that relationship. I think for that might explain a little bit why so far TPS for El Salvador is safe. I don't think we can assume anything is safe. And Salvadorans who came in on family parole programs who are waiting for visas in the United States are going to be affected by some of the Trump administration's hostility towards parole. So I'm not saying that, the Trump administration is in love with Salvadoran immigrants. I'm just saying that TPS for now with El Salvador might be safe because of these political determinations and again, has nothing to do with conditions in El Salvador. Just like the Venezuela and Haiti decisions don't have anything to do with conditions there.
Yes, I think it's important also to add that this is all under the foreign policy of America first. It's this huge transformational shift that it's all, and it goes back to the concept of the national interest. It's not how the US understands that it can contribute to improve the situation worldwide or in specific countries, understanding that it ultimately also helps the situation of the US. Now the US is a selfish, petulant child that it's only thinking of himself. The rest, you're on your own. And that's a huge change in terms of foreign policy that we are all really trying to understand its wide implications. I would like to go to a number of questions on children that I think that are important. So they are asking in this regard, what protection measures are there for children who are seeking protection, and how are they being specifically impacted in the US? That's one question. There's another even more specific. What recommendations can we give professionals who work with unaccompanied children in red states, that is in Republican states. When we see state legislators promoting multiple anti-immigrant bills. So I think that that's one that has a number of questions. I would like to move on to others and give you all the chance if you want to discuss them. There is a question about the registry. What can you share about the new mandatory register for immigrants? And there was also a comment above mentioning that this was a policy that had been used in the past with persons of Muslim religion during 9/11 and also with Japanese nationals. So if you can build that. There are also a number of questions which are challenging us to think about how can we build power and obtain greater participation from others in the fight for justice. And they are also asking specifically about how civil society organizations can articulate better and prepare and assist people who are being forcibly returned to their countries or origin, and how and from where will they seek the funds to do this kind of work. Finally, there is another question on the executive order of English only, and whether you think that it could have any impact on those people who are seeking asylum. So who would like to start in this round?
I don't mind starting with very general observations. I don't think I can answer many of these questions, but sort of like with regards to children seeking protection, I'm going to focus on the children that are arriving at the border. Like I mentioned, because of the presidential proclamation, the government is effectively turning away everyone who's approaching the border to seek protection, and this includes children. It includes survivors of trafficking. Basically, the sort of like the special protections that these populations have in the law and that sort of like were respected to some extent. For example, when we had Title 42 expulsions, which had exceptions for children, for example, we're not seeing those this time around, and that is precisely something that the litigation is trying to get at, is sort of saying because of this proclamation and this supposed invasion, you cannot simply ignore all of our international and domestic obligations that we have to asylum seekers, including children who deserve and are entitled to special protections. The question about helping unaccompanied children in red states, especially as anti-immigrant bills come out, I don't have a strong answer for that, but I would encourage everyone representing asylum seekers, including unaccompanied minors, to reach out to the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, and I'll put the link in the chat, to request assistance in cases. The Center for Gender and Refugee Studies is a resource center for advocates and attorneys that litigate these cases. So we will be more than happy to review your request and provide any assistance possible in those cases. And I'll leave it at that, and happy to hear the answers from my colleagues.
Thank you, Felipe. Maureen.
Maybe just to complement, I think what Felipe said about unaccompanied children, I think it's important to look at what happened with the executive order that was meant to halt legal aid for unaccompanied migrant children, that was going to Acacia Center and others, which is basically the fact that, babies shouldn't be representing themselves in court, or 1-year-olds, and it was put in place and then rescinded a few days later because of the big backlash from that. If I remember, there were 150,000 letters that were sent to congressional offices and others about like, this can't happen. And so I think it does reflect the fact that there is like a tipping point in terms of even US public opinion of these are basic rights. Babies, children have the right to have guaranteed legal representation. And so at least in that sense, maybe not is all lost, that there are certain points to how do you mobilize more public opinion, which I think goes back to the reflections here about the narrative and how do you talk more about, what's a humane response to migration, which is also the right to like legal representation, I would say for all cases, but especially the most vulnerable, which would be certainly unaccompanied children. I wanted to touch on 2 other questions that were put in there, which I think are pretty interesting, which is what is the role of the private sector? And I think this is something that needs to be discussed more, because there is a lot of need for labor in the United States right now, and particularly I mean, there's going to be a lot of backlash between the agricultural sector, the dairy sector, which probably half of the population that works on them is undocumented. But also, let's talk about reconstruction from the natural disasters that hit Florida, North Carolina last year, plus the fires in California. I mean, there's a huge need for labor in the United States that we've already seen has not necessarily been filled by the current population or documented labor in the United States. And so I think the real question is, what will be the response from the private sector to the need to have labor? Will they be pushed to have more seasonal, temporary work visas, some other way to really respond to? These are people that contribute to our population. How do we work to better protect them instead of deporting them? And so I think there is a big question there of what the private sector's role will be. And then lastly, just with UNHCR and IOM, there was a question there about how to work without funding. I would say this will be touched on next week, but the lack of US funding is really crippling UNHCR's ability to plan for the year. It's not that they don't have funding, but they don't have all of the funding. And so thinking, what does that mean for the whole menu of services that they provide, plus the work that they, with local partners, which right now a lot of them are paused in their work. But interestingly enough, the money that was put into one of the waivers from Secretary Rubio was to fund IOM to do voluntary returns. So what the U.S. is prioritizing right now, and I think it's again noteworthy to where this direction is going, and what Helena talked about of what's in the U.S. best interest, it's helping people return to their home country, not whether they should qualify for protection or be supported in the migration route or requesting protection here or in another country. So I think there is going to be a longer battle on this. There's a lot of discussion in Congress. Organizations, including WOLA and others that are here, have raised the need to support countries, support local organizations in receiving migrants, if you want to also look at how do you support people settling closer to their home and not just migration to the United States. So if you want to curb mass migration to the United States, then you should certainly be supporting countries that are receiving migrants or supporting home countries as they receive their repatriated citizens. So I would just leave it at that. There's a lot of battle to come, and I think next week's discussion will also be a great way to kind of delve more into how the region itself is responding.
Yes, before giving the floor to Yala, I just want to add also something. If there are no funds to address the root causes of migration, the only expectation is that those factors that continue to push people out of their countries will exacerbate in the coming years. And so a number of questions that you have on the chat about what's going to happen is what we will discuss in the next webinar. But it's the structural conditions in the country, plus the returns and the people who are in transit and are now finding themselves that this is their the new country where they may stay. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, two things. I want to address registry, which somebody asked about the registration thing, which I'll do in a second. I just wanted to say two things related to what was just discussed. One is on the use of what funding is allowed for the State Department to use. And again, this will be discussed next webinar, is really geared towards not what it's supposed to be doing, which is protecting refugees and displaced people, but, facilitating their return to their home country, or, there's sort of been a perversion of resettlement where, as I mentioned when I was talking about refugee resettlement, where, all the refugee ban is in place, but the Trump administration wants to keep one refugee resettlement center abroad, the one in Africa, open so it can resettle Afrikaner refugees from South Africa who do not want to come here. And this underlies a sort of racism that I just feel like I have to say out loud, that it pervades also the TPS undesignations, or, rescindent of TPS. And many of the lawsuits around TPS call that racism out explicitly. And make the argument that, the reason these TPS are, one of the ways that these TPS decisions are illegal is because they're driven by racial animus, full stop. So just wanted to make sure that was, mentioned, because it is, part of what's going on too. There's this sort of racism underlying all this sort of really white nationalism, sort of underlying a lot of what's going on. And on the registry, and this relates to registry because, as was mentioned, the first time registry was used actually was the first registry provision in U.S. law, immigration law, was actually for Chinese immigrants who, in the 19th century, who the U.S., Chinese people were the first group of people to be targeted for exclusion in the United States based on their race. So the underlying racism in immigration law that we have today comes from those original decisions about Chinese immigrants and keeping Chinese people out of the country, saying that they were unassimilable, they should never have access to citizenship, that they were invading the country. Like, a lot of this rhetoric is really, really old and started with that kind of language about Chinese people. And one of the laws that was put in place, like literally in the 1890s, we're going way back, that's how far back we're going, was to require that every Chinese person in the United States register. And one of the things that happened almost immediately was that the law was abused and suspended, and that people who actually had certificates weren't allowed to come in, and it was immediately used as a tool of exclusion and detention. And I think the reason I'm mentioning that is that the registry provision, one could argue that, and I've heard it said, what does it matter? Like, we should know who everybody is in this country. Like, just register. It's a good thing for us to know who everybody is. But that is clearly not what is driving the desire to register people. And the problem with the registry provision is that it's asking undocumented people to register, which people are scared to do because they think that will put a target on their back for deportation. But if they don't register, to avoid it, they can be accused of being criminals, because if you don't register, it's also a criminal violation. You can be deported for that. So that's not good. And then the other thing is that it's a show me your papers kind of law, because even people who have registered it can be demanded of them to prove that they have. And if they don't happen to be carrying the papers that prove that they have, that could also lead to them being arrested. So this is really a provision that's driven by a desire to racially profile people who seem like they shouldn't be in the country. So I just wanted to say that. And I think, we don't yet have this registration requirement was announced. It's going to roll out a new form and a new process to allow people to register has to be created. A regulation has to be started. So it hasn't started yet. Nobody should be trying to register. Do not try to register. It hasn't started yet. And it's immediately, I think, going to be challenged for some of the reasons that I've said. Litigation is being prepared to challenge the registration form as soon as it comes out. So again, I want to be clear-eyed as to where this is coming from, this desire to register people, and to know that it's, again, I think it's part of this process of scaring people, rather than, saying, oh, getting people out of the showers and allowing them to announce themselves. And I would say, like, the one time registration was used sort of less nefariously in the United States after World War II, it was driven by this desire to actually provide legalization for people. You're registering so you could legalize. That's not what's happening now. You're registering so you can be targeted. And I think people are worried about that, rightfully so, and I think it will be challenged right away.
Thank you. Thank you, Yao. Crystal, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, Helena, thank you. So a lot of the things have already been mentioned, but just adding a little bit of how I see it on the ground. So for the English part, I think it almost feels like on purpose, like an attack. We see people that have been recently deported in Mexico, and they're not giving anything in Spanish. They're giving everything in English. They don't even understand what process they went into, what happened. That's if they're giving any paperwork. When they're navigating, like when there is like the asylum application, the I-589, it's very confusing. It's all in English. They have to do all this translations. and they don't even, it's hard to navigate even when they're released on any type of, like from ICE custody or from CBP or Border Patrol, and they're provided with any of the paperwork, and it's all in English. All the steps are in English. It's extremely, extremely difficult for them to understand what's going on, what's happening. And I think it's just a way to make it even more difficult when it's already very, very extremely difficult. And especially with the executive orders and everything that's provided on the White House page, everything's in English, and it's even hard sometimes to provide some context right away about, like, without going through the translation and translating and trying to say things to explain it in a way. So it just creates that extra step for everyone to do, and sometimes things get lost in all of that, especially time consuming. And then for the registration, what Yael was mentioning, I just think it's just also instills fear in the community. I have people in Mexico asking me if they should register when, you think about it and you're like, no, but it's just meant to create more of this confusion and gossip, and people are asking about all these things. Should I do it? Should I not? And often people want to comply because they think that at some point people thought that this was the new CBP1, or this was the new way to get at some point with the government so that they could at least look at their case. So, when you have all these restrictive policies and then you give something like this, it almost seems like a glimpse of hope for them. And so it's almost playing with those feelings, on real time with people that are very, very vulnerable, and that they don't know what to do and what the process is, and they're stuck in this limbo. And then for the unaccompanied children, we saw, because of the cut in funding, we saw the withdrawal of kids in need of defense out of Mexico. So they did all this accompaniment from Mexico, and with both sides, we would sometimes help and collaborate with families. And so now we see that too being affected. And that's if the child even gets to the border, because sometimes now that there's new rules in Mexico where the child, it's supposed to go directly to the Attorney General's office. They create a case, and then it's now in the jurisdiction of thief. But when we had those cases, we would collaborate, and there's not that anymore. So now we have to go back to trying to see with the government, what can we do? And obviously with, like, como digo, con los tres chícharos que somos, o sea, we're three people, and that's how much we're going to be able to accompany. And so that's kind of what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a final roundup. We are being asked whether we think that some of these measures are only temporary, or whether they are going to stand for the long run. And of course, whether we think, connected to that is the question as to whether we think the administration is going to get the funds it expects from Congress to implement its full deportation wishes. And I think that's a question that I would like to ask you to address. And finally, there's also one about Cubans and the Cuban Adjustment Act. What is happening with them? That perhaps are the two in the final minutes we have. Is any of you that would like to try to answer any of them?
I would just say I have no doubt that the budget is going to move forward at some level, because the Republicans are in control of, because of the mechanism they're using in terms of reconciliation, when you don't need more than 50 votes in the Senate, that we will see a very large package that is meant to fund deportation machinery, increased immigration detention center, everything that we know is in there. So I think the numbers now are lower because there is less space to hold people and there's less resources. I think we should operate on the thought that this is just going to get bigger and prepare accordingly, but also work to how do we keep resisting? How can we support the lawsuits? What happens with the legal challenge, I think, is important, but I think we should all be also thinking that this, at least for right now, is going to be, where the administration is. Whether public opinion follows that, I think we will see. There was a lot of pushback in the first Trump administration about family separation and other areas. So I think we need to keep pushing for the humane treatment of everyone in the United States and access to legal protections. But I think we should operate under the fact that this is at least where things are, and we'll move forward.
Thank you, Maureen.
I could also add
Go
very
ahead.
briefly about sort of like the intention. I'm pretty sure the administration has every intention and desire to make this policy stick and to make them permanent in multiple ways. That said, as we saw in the first administration, they're not necessarily doing things the best way, the most legal way, or the smartest way. So we've seen challenges. We will continue to see challenges, and some things will stick, some things will not. And I think that that's sort of going to be the reality of litigation. But I do think that it's important to consider, like during the first Trump administration, he implemented certain policies that even with strong advocacy during the Biden administration remained in place for a long time. So that's something, I think that's something that we will see, sort of like how the narrative and how sort of like the standards move to the right in certain ways, like the bar is moved, and then we're sort of like in a position where we're arguing for things that we had already achieved in the past, to say it in some way. And also recognizing that even when we have successes in litigation, the damage in many cases is done for many people that are impacted, that are caught in the middle of it, or that are caught in the confusion of it. So again, litigation, very important tool to make sure that most or some of these policies don't stick. But again, it will not be the savior, or will it be able to fully prevent the damage that will be done over many people?
Yeah, and if I could I agree with especially the bar shifting comment. I think on foreign policy, that's definitely the case. I worry about the aid architecture internationally forever now, that some damage will be hard to undo, and that will be discussed in the next webinar, I think. But one thing I wanted to mention is like we should continue to push in Congress. The funding, I think Maureen's probably right. Like a significant amount of funding is going to get through, but the laws being changed, I think we do have a chance to prevent, fundamental laws from being changed, and we should continue to do so. The Lake and Riley Act passed too quickly and cannot be repeated again. So we do have a lot of work in Congress to make sure that the law isn't shifted under the feet of the litigators that are actually trying to protect people in Congress. So we have a lot to do in Congress. And there has been some things that have been affected already. The Guantanamo situation is being reconsidered already. Like, they're not going to probably send 30,000 people to Guantanamo. They're stopping the military flights because it's silly and absurd. And that was because people pointed that out. And because it's logistically really messy. And as Felipe said, they're not doing things the best way. They're just doing things to be cruel and, and quick about things. So some of these things we can push back. I think reporters are doing a decent job. We need to encourage reporters to keep reporting on things like Guantanamo and these arrangements with other countries that will also be discussed next webinar. And we can push from the region. We can stop deportations to other countries, these third countries, Panama, Costa Rica, if we get those countries to say no. So there are other ways we can think about kind of slowing down the deportation machine that, I hope we get to talk about next week too.
Thank you very much. We are mindful of the time. I think this was a really good conversation. Our goal with this effort is to share information. Unfortunately, this may be a practice that we may need to implement in other opportunities because the situation, as we have heard, is changing. There is a big effort to try everything to see what is able to pass some legal tests and what remains in operation. But the first thing, and that's why we organize this event, is information is key. We need to make sure that people understand what's happening in the region and that people are not trying to get to the US to seek asylum. They need to understand that that is not possible at this time. We also need to understand better what is taking place so that we can advocate for immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. The information is power, and it's one of the elements in terms of how we organize. There are a number of questions that really challenge us all. How do we think about counter narratives? How are we building power in different ways? The role of the countries of the Latin American countries is going to be addressed in the next conversation, and we really, really invite you all to tune for that one. This is This is a marathon. This is not a sprint, and we understand that, and we invite you all to continue tuning in, to continue receiving information and sharing information. That is the first step, and we are aiming, of course, to organize across borders, because we understand that the people that are being impacted are in their countries of origin, are in third countries, are in countries where they thought they would be protected, and they are finding that that is not the case. So our collective action will hopefully help people, and that's the reason behind what we are doing here today. Thank you to our 4 fabulous panelists. Thank you to the organizations behind this effort for putting us all here together. And we will see you in a week. I want to make sure that the last thing I do is that I share the link for the next webinar, because as I promised, you cannot miss it, and all you have to do is just register for it. I am including it right now on the chat, so please do not leave without clicking on that link and registering for our next conversation in a week. Thank you very much, everyone. We're sorry we couldn't open the mic, and thank you for those also efforts from Africa to connect on narratives. That's something that we will continue. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.